I'm going to be speaking about a 1567 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses that is known to have had a profound influence on Shakespeare. And I'm going to be asking a somewhat controversial question. Could this translation be the work of the same person who wrote the works of Shakespeare? I believe it is. It is sometimes said that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, and there is no evidence to suggest otherwise. Well, after spending 18 years studying this question, I've come to the conclusion that there are basically two approaches to the Shakespeare authorship question. One is essentially faith-based, and the other is evidence-based. Now, you may be skeptical about this distinction, but what other explanation can you think of for the emotionality of traditional Shakespeareans when their beloved author from Stratford is challenged? An important way to set the stage for my topic is by telling you about research that suggests the Elizabethan age was the golden age for literary anonymity. It was only starting in the 20th century that it became common for writers to sign their works with their actual names. Penn State scholar Marcy North wrote an authoritative 2003 book on what she calls the anonymous Renaissance. Although Stratfordians like to claim that the name Shakespeare on a play proves who wrote it, North counters that a printed author's name may still be a, quote, fiction created by the author that is subject to interpretation and that is unreliable historically. She mentions that Lord Burleigh, Queen Elizabeth's principal secretary, and the Earl of Oxford's father-in-law is known to have published political propaganda anonymously. And in a 1999 article, North said that Oxford is one of the Elizabethan poets whose attributed work is so scarce because of, quote, the courtier's fashion of limiting readership through close manuscript circulation rather than printed books. For the nobility, this was often a show of false modesty. Although the stigma of print usually prevented them from publishing their works under their own names in their lifetime, noblemen would often circulate handwritten copies of their sonnets to their friends. I need to explain that for Renaissance poets and writers, translating poetry and prose was held in high regard, assuming it was well done. It was considered an original creative act, much like writing a new poem. And we know that the Earl of Oxford was involved with literary translations. At 22, Oxford sponsored the publication of the Latin translation of Castiglione's famous book, The Courtier, a book known to have influenced Shakespeare. Possibly that translation was Oxford's own work, because Castiglione himself wrote that a nobleman who is a writer must, quote, take care to keep his literary works under cover. A year later, when he was 23, Oxford wrote a commendatory poem for the English translation of the Latin original of Cardanus's Comfort, again, possibly Oxford's own translation. And it's another work that influenced Shakespeare. Now, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to speculate that the Earl of Oxford, or perhaps his guardian Lord Burleigh, had Arthur Golding's name published as the ostensible author of the 1567 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's a translation that is praised in the anonymous 1589 Art of English Poesy, likely to have been written by Oxford. One particular type of pen name is known as an allonym, that's A-L-L-O-N-Y-M, since it's the name of a real person, just not the real author. I believe Golding is an allonym as translator of the Ovid translation. Here is one documented example of an Elizabethan earl trying to use an allonym. The secretary of the Earl of Essex wrote that Essex asked Fulk Greville to allow him to sign a document written by Essex as being by F.G., Fulk Greville. Essex's motives included a wish not to appear too self-congratulatory in this, self-congratulatory account of Essex's role in the 1596 Battle of Cadiz. Jonathan Bate writes that, quote, Ovid was Shakespeare's favorite classical poet. About 90% of Shakespeare's allusions to classical mythology come from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Bate says that Shakespeare showed interest in the, quote, minutiae of Ovid's language, even to the end of his career, and he translated Ovid's bodily metamorphoses into, quote, psychological transformations and vivid verbal and visual metaphors. In particular, he found in Ovid a great store of examples of female feeling, end of quotation. John Nims, in his introduction to the Golding Metamorphoses, muses about the flagrant paradox of Arthur Golding, the, quote, convinced Puritan who spent much of his life translating the sermons and commentaries of John Calvin, undertaking to translate into English this work of Ovid, quote, the sophisticated darling of a dissolute society, the author of a scandalous handbook of seduction, end quote. He's talking about The Art of Love by Ovid. Unwittingly assisting the reattribution of this translation to Golding's precocious nephew, yes, the Earl of Oxford was Arthur Golding's nephew, Nims calls this notion of Golding choosing to translate this work, quote, hardly less striking than the Metamorphoses the work dealt with, especially given how much racier this translation is than Ovid's original. Unfortunately, our attribution of many Elizabethan works became set in stone before the more recent scholarship by Marcy North and others on anonymous, pseudonymous, and al-anonymous Elizabethan authorship was more fully appreciated. No doubt, some of his contemporaries knew Oxford was the real translator, and that was probably one reason that Shakespeare's contemporaries spoke of his poetry as that of an English Ovid. That is, Shakespeare was called an English Ovid. Among the growing evidence that the Earl of Oxford is the true author behind the pen name William Shakespeare, 3 of the 4 leading literary sources for Shakespeare's works are crucial in their authorship significance. Now, the 4th, which we don't yet have a connection for, is Holinshed's Chronicles, Histories of England. So the 3 that are connected with Oxford are Plutarch's Lives, which was purchased by Oxford when he was 20 years old, the Geneva Bible, purchased by Oxford the same year and annotated in a way that Roger Strittmatter has shown correlates closely with Shakespeare's biblical echoes. Finally, this 1567 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses that is my subject. Oxfordians have long speculated that the adolescent Oxford may have collaborated with the ostensible author of the first complete English translation of Ovid's poem. Again, the supposed translator was the Puritan Arthur Golding, Oxford's uncle, who lived in the same household with him when the translation was published. Yet why would a Puritan have translated Ovid, whom Colin Burrows says was considered in the late 16th century, quote, by far the sexiest poet from antiquity? It's significant that Shakespeare scholars, who often don't seem to agree about anything, have a strong consensus about just how influential this Ovid translation was on Shakespeare. They find traces of it in nearly every Shakespeare play, as well as in his sonnets. In 2015, the University of Virginia's Gordon Braden wrote, quote, in the Renaissance, a continuum ran from the most literal translation to a general kind of literary imitation to what we think of as original literary production. A major case in point is Ovid, whom most Renaissance writers, Shakespeare among them, read in the original Latin, but whom they also translated repeatedly. Wait, did Gordon Braden just say that Shakespeare translated Ovid? He sure came close to saying it. Later, Braden observes that The Tempest is Shakespeare's, quote, capstone work, his summing up of the power and nature of his theatrical craft. In Act 5, Prospero gives a speech that, quote, begins as a virtual translation of the Golding version of Medea's speech in Ovid. Braden continues, quote, it seems appropriate that a centerpiece of this summing up would be the most extensive of the direct borrowings from Ovid that characterize Shakespeare's writing almost from the beginning. Here's another piece of historical information that will help set the context for the rest of my talk. Philology is a traditional field that lies at the intersection of literary criticism history, and linguistics. In the Renaissance, there was enormous interest in establishing accurate texts of Latin and Greek classics and of the Bible when available manuscripts came in multiple conflicting versions. We can't find a better example of a Renaissance philologist than Lorenzo Valla, V-A-L-L-A. While employed by the Vatican in 1440, Valla exposed a crucial manuscript as a forgery. This was the famous Donation of Constantine, ostensibly signed by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, donating the Western Roman Empire to the Roman Catholic Church. As early as the 11th century, the Church cited this manuscript to legitimize its secular power. But Valla was so familiar with the subtle changes in the Latin language over the centuries that he proved this alleged 4th century work was about 400 years more recent. His textual analysis is still accepted today as valid. The Church, however, did not allow Valla's analysis to be published for nearly 80 years for reasons that are understandable. Now, I don't expect my discussion of the Ovid translation to be any more welcomed by the Shakespeare authorities, but I hope you will remember Lorenzo Valla as I now transition to some philological details of word coinages, spelling, and matters of style. We know that Shakespeare coined many new words and phrases. In this translation of the Metamorphoses, Oxford coined around 100 new words, including now common words such as disbar, dribble, foredeck, hamstring, hard-faced, mother country, nightclothes, outstrip, pawing, pleasureless, Pythian, restlessly, screech owl, and sylvan. Even more significantly, several of these coined words later appear in Shakespeare's works. Hamstring once, seated as an adjective once, overpeer to rise above once, sea nymph once, beteem twice, outstrip 4 times, and screech owl 5 times. Shakespeare, by the way, shows such an interest in birds that at least one book is devoted entirely to that subject. Although I haven't found the word in Shakespeare, Oxford also coined in this translation the word swanny, S-W-A-N-N-Y, meaning abounding in swans. Caroline Spurgeon said that birds are one of Shakespeare's top 3 sources of imagery. Shakespeare's henditis, or particular type of word doubles I'll be talking about later, sometimes assists him in explaining newly coined words when he adds and, then a synonym for a new word. Shakespeare is also said to have coined more than 300 words beginning UN. Remarkably, this translation of Ovid coins 16 such words: uncorporal, unmameable, unreal to unwind, unfrayed, unambitious, unsurmised, unastaunched, unsent for, unavoided, which is used 4 times in Shakespeare, unwish, used twice in Shakespeare, unhated, unwieldsome, unfaded, unbetrayed, unhacked, unappeased. This similar interest in inventing words starting in UN increases the likelihood that Shakespeare translated this work. Idiosyncratic spellings offer us further philological evidence. In Book 6, named and A-A, M-D-E, is rhymed with ashamed, S-A-S-H-A-A-M-D. In my search of the vast database Early English Books Online, or EBO for short, I found named spelled that way only one other time, and ashamed only this one time. This matches Oxford's quirky way of doubling vowels in his surviving letters. Examples of double A spellings in Oxford's surviving letters include call, C-A-A-L-E, called, C-A-A-L-D, fall, F-A-A-L-E, halls, H-A-A-L-E-S, Wales, W-A-A-L-E-S, and Cornwall, C-O-R-N-W-A-A-L-E. And I might say, when we're trying to compare this evidence for Oxford to evidence for the traditional author, the man from Stratford, we have not a single letter from Shakespeare of Stratford. So Oxford spelled the words I just mentioned with a double A when no one else did at that time, searching in Ebo. Other double A spellings occur only in the Oxford translation, but nowhere else in the 60,000 or so fully searchable books on that database, Ebo. They include, and all these have double A's, quaked, shaked, inflamed, spaked, makest, prepared, dared, raised, blazed. Scholar W.H.D. Rouse noted that in the 1575 second complete edition of Ovid, spellings are changed from the more regular ones of 1567, when the first 4 books of Ovid's Metamorphoses were published in translation, to more idiosyncratic ones. There are many more double vowels, including B-E-E for the verb be, not the insect, he with 2 E's, she with 2 E's, we with 2 E's, do, D-O-O, T-O-O rather than T-O, and mother, M-O-O-T-H-E-R. Rouse also singled out the following quirky spellings from the second edition: B-I-N for bin, B-L-U-D for blood, D-E-T-H for death, here, H-E-A-R-E, heart, H-A-R-T, and H-I-R for her. Every single one of those unusual spellings are also found in Oxford's letters. Books 1 through 4 of the translation, as I said, appeared in 1565 when Oxford was only 15. Its dedicatory epistle states it was written at Cecil House when Oxford and his maternal uncle and likely Latin tutor Arthur Golding both lived there. The entire book was published 2 years later in 1567. That was the only English translation of the work directly from the Latin original until 1621. The Golding Ovid was republished in 1575, 1603, and 1612, attesting to its popularity. In addition to its immense influence on Shakespeare, this translation also influenced Spenser and Marlowe. They each knew Latin well enough to read Ovid in the original, so their respect for this translation increases the likelihood that it was done by a writer of the caliber of Shakespeare rather than by Golding. We might pause for a moment to ask if it is conceivable that a boy of 15 could possibly have written the first 4 books of this translation. I think the answer is yes, since we are talking about the greatest writer in the history of English literature. Studies of the psychology of creativity have concluded that childhood loss often contributes to creativity in talented individuals. Oxford lost his father 3 years before his translation of Ovid first appeared, and turning to a work written 1,500 years earlier may have offered Oxford something from an escape from the many stresses of his young life. Further, we know Shakespeare was one of the greatest literary geniuses of all time. Among the most implausible features of the traditional authorship theory is the assumption that Shakespeare began his writing career at the height of his creative powers, with no developmental trajectory. If Oxford composed this translation, we can form a more realistic picture of the maturation of his literary genius from precocious child to author of Shakespeare's mature works. In any event, there have been child prodigies in many creative fields, including literature. One thinks of the 18th century English poet Thomas Chatterton, who took his own life at 17 after his forgeries of the poems of an invented medieval monk were finally exposed. Or the 19th century French poet Arthur Rimbaud. One of his best poems, Ophélie, was composed when he was only 15, and he ended his creative writing by the age of 20. A third example is Mary Shelley, who wrote her classic Frankenstein when she was only 19. Elizabeth Sears has even proposed that the 10-year-old Oxford wrote a short 1560 work based on Ovid, The Fable of Ovid, treating of Narcissus. Ezra Pound, in the ABC of Reading, a 1934 book, called the Golding translation of Ovid, quote, the most beautiful book in the English language, adding, My opinion, and I suspect it was Shakespeare's. If Pound had only written, I suspect it was Shakespeare's translation, then I would be in complete agreement with him. Pound emphasized that, quote, I do not honestly think that anyone can know anything about the art of lucid narrative in English without seeing the whole of the Golding volume. Pound is hyperbolic in his praise of this translation. In another essay, he calls Golding Ovid's equal. He goes on, quote, Is there one of us so good at his Latin and so reading in imagination that Golding will not throw upon his mind shades and glamours inherent in the original text which had for all that escaped him? It is certain that we have forgotten our Ovid since Golding went out of print. In his 1964 poetry anthology Confucius to Cummings, Pound devoted 28 pages to Golding's Metamorphoses, compared with only 24 pages to Shakespeare. As I mentioned, many scholars strongly link the Golding Ovid with Shakespeare. L.P. Wilkinson writes, quote, Shakespeare draws on every book of the Golding Metamorphoses, and there is scarcely a play that shows no trace of its influence. Ovid's book is mentioned explicitly in Titus Andronicus in Act 4. The context, interestingly enough, is the need to solve a puzzle of anonymity. Lavinia, the daughter of Titus, has been raped, and her tongue and hands have been cut off so that she cannot name her rapists. As a first step toward communicating her plight, she looks through several books and turns the pages of one book in particular. When Titus asks his grandson which book it is, he replies, Grandsire, 'tis Ovid's Metamorphoses. My mother gave it me. Lavinia turns the pages until she finds the story of the rape of Philomel, who also had her tongue cut off by her rapist. The unifying theme of Ovid's poem is transformation from one shape into another. The gods regularly transform people into animals, trees, and flowers. To quote the poem, quote, and aptly into any shape his person he can shift. This is precisely what the young Oxford accomplished by allowing his uncle to sign Oxford's translation and to use a variety of other allonyms and pseudonyms during his long literary career. Several Oxfordians, that is, those of us who believe the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare, have already agreed that Oxford may well have been the translator of this work. Now I will move on to a seemingly abstruse but inherently interesting topic, word pairs in Shakespeare and in this Ovid translation. I want to say a few words about this rhetorical device of doubling now, and I'll return to the subject later. Hendiadys, H-E-N-D-I-A-D-Y-S, Greek for one by means of two, is a technical term of rhetoric that refers to a particular sort of word pair defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as, quote, a figure of speech in which a single complex idea is expressed by two words connected by a conjunction. The first two uses of that English word hendiadys given by the Oxford English Dictionary are in the anonymous 1589 Art of English Poesy, which I have attributed to Oxford, and in the 1592 The English Secretary by Angel Day, who was Oxford's literary secretary at the time. Hendiadys is found more often in Shakespeare than in any other Elizabethan writer, so its profusion in the Golding Ovid is presumptive evidence of Oxford's authorship of this noted translation. Oxford helped introduce hendiadys into English literature from Virgil's use of it in Latin. Yes, Virgil, not Ovid. It's not in Ovid nearly as often as in Oxford's translation of Ovid. We have to admit there is no definitive consensus among Shakespeare scholars about just what constitutes hendiadys. George Wright, in a classic article that I have found to be the best one on the topic, helped draw attention to the fact that Shakespeare uses this figure of hendiadys more than 300 times. Examples that have entered common use include sound and fury, slings and arrows, lean and hungry. Wright excludes from his use of the term what he derisively calls Shakespeare's ceremonious parading of synonyms, that is, two closely related words, without any significant increment, usually for an effect of expansion or elevation. If we follow Wright in his derogation of insufficiently complex word pairs, I think we will deprive ourselves of taking the full measure of Oxford's lifelong fascination with verbal doubling and the growth and development that his use of them underwent in his writing career. I believe they tell us something important about Oxford's mind. One thing reminded him of another, and he linked them with a conjunction. One word alone often did not suffice, and in pairing it with a second word, he drew a line that gestured toward meanings that go beyond mere words. Wright specifies that, as Shakespeare usually used the figure, quote, the parallel structure may mask some more complex and less easily describable dependent relation between the two words. Further, classical henditis, including in Shakespeare, should have an, quote, element of surprise, of improvisation, and of eccentric coordination. Wright finds that henditis in Shakespeare, quote, normally but not invariably occurs in passages of a certain elevation, dignity, or remoteness from ordinary experience. Gordon Braden writes compellingly of the Ovid translation attributed to Golding. In the process, he drops numerous hints that are more consistent with Oxford, not Golding, having been the actual translator. For example, he notes that Golding did not use as much henditis, which Braden calls doublets, in his later works, but in the translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses attributed to Golding, quote, he often renders a single Latin word twice or more. Braden implies that one source of henditis in Oxford's Ovid is the translator's, quote, habit of translating by multiple synonyms. Every translator knows there are often no exact equivalents going from one language to another, so the use of two words in English helps capture the Latin original. Braden notes that in Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare apparently quotes about half of one of Golding's lines almost verbatim. That is, a crown of fresh and fragrant flowers in Ovid becomes coronet of fresh and fragrant flowers in Midsummer Night's Dream. So note, echoed henditis. Braden ascribes youthful qualities to this translation. This is wonderful. Quote, in a simple and even naive way, Golding just wants to be easy to follow. Braden says that the translator's attitude towards Ovid is not sophisticated detachment, but a deep, naive intimidation. The translation is full of moments of quietly spreading astonishment, and the quality of astonishment is childlike. Braden is an honest scholar and does not conceal these observations, despite their enhancing our sense that Golding's connection with Ovid is often considered a matter for surprise and something of a puzzle. Further, Braden perceptibly links parallels between the Golding, Ovid, and later works of Shakespeare. Shakespeare understood Ovid's Latin better than did Golding. That is, the adult Oxford compared with the teenage Oxford. Braden says, reading Golding, we can trace the beginnings of a particular poetic world that Shakespeare 20 years later would bring to its fullest development. Thank you, Gordon Braden. There are numerous instances of Shakespeare later echoing the word pairs introduced in this translation of Ovid, sometimes by using the two words in close proximity. Yes, there is no doubt this translation was one of Shakespeare's most significant literary sources, but this pattern of echoes, reminiscent of Carl Jung's word association test to assess the uniqueness of each personality, further suggests a similar process of verbal association in the minds or mind of the translator and of Ovid's works. In the mind of the translator and the author of Shakespeare. I'll now move on to some other observations of word pairs in Ovid that illustrate other features of them. Oxford combined enjambment with alliteration when he wrote, quote, the lords and commons did lament, and married wives with torn and tattered hair did cry alas. Enjambment, meaning there's not a pause at the end of a line. Line breaks encourage the reader not to treat the word pairs as too closely related by forcing us to pause at least a little between them. And in general, word pairs force the reader to slow down as the poem pauses to intensify a point. This is a frequent characteristic of the Psalms of David, which were a major literary influence on Shakespeare. The second word in a word pair may amplify the first, as in with sad and weeping eyes. Here and elsewhere, the first word, sad, describes an inner emotional state, whereas the second word, weeping, offers a concrete external expression of that inner state. Oxford has been ridiculed for what is called excessive alliteration in his early poetry, to which he signed his name or initials. Likewise, in this poem, which includes lines like, "The wonted weight was from the wain, the which they well did wot." Caroline Spurgeon notes that one of Shakespeare's favorite images comes from the human body in motion. Here, Oxford writes of ships that did leap and dance. Elsewhere, Oxford writes, in this translation, "Thou shouldest there of brass and steel," substantial C. Shakespeare, in Sonnet 20, repeats that same word pair, "unless my nerves were brass or hammered steel." Some further general comments. George Wright observes that from the beginning, paired words in Shakespeare are used to give a feeling of elevation or complexity. What Wright considers true henditis in its best examples make us feel that some structural situation we had become ready for has jumped and become a different structural situation. One is reminded of the many jolting syntactical pivots in the sonnets. I do not presume to judge what is an acceptable henditis and what is what Wright called a mere parading of synonyms. I believe we can better appreciate the development of Oxford's use of henditis by casting a wider net than Wright does. Doing so allows us to see just how many word pairs Oxford coined in this early work, again, 1567 for the complete translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Later writers paid tribute to many of them by borrowing them, in some cases dozens of times. That is a word pair used for the first time in this 1567 translation, then borrowed by other writers dozens of times. Wright observes that Shakespeare's examples are dazzlingly various, that the developing playwright seems to have taken this odd figure to his bosom and to have made it entirely his own. We have a misleadingly limited picture of Shakespeare's development if we remain unaware of his earlier work that has not previously been attributed to the same author. Wright is disappointed that Shakespeare scholars have shown so little interest in Shakespeare's style, especially those stylistic devices that make for elusiveness. Henditis is too confusing, too disorderly. Critics often take little interest in the figurative devices that seem merely decorative. Wright contends that Shakespeare's henditis is always somewhat mysterious and elusive. Wright speculates that it may at times betoken Shakespeare's teeming mind. At other times, he senses that it suggests an oddly empty, discordant, and disconnected feeling. Normal unions are disassembled. Henditis served to remind us how uncertain and treacherous language can be, as it increasingly used as it expresses deceptive linking. Wright is brilliant in perceiving the way Oxford increasingly used henditis to construct the extreme and enigmatic complexity of his writing. Henditis, far from explaining mysteries, establishes them. Henditis resists logical analysis, and it serves at once to deny and to extend the adequacy of linguistic forms to convey our experience. As Wright notes, the usual conjunction in henditis is and, A-N-D, but in Oxford's use, it thwarts our expectation that we will be given a clear parallelism, which is among our major instruments for ordering the world we live in. Wright says that Shakespeare's henditis can be estranging, and that it usually elevates the discourse and blurs its logical lines, and this combination of grandeur and confusion is in keeping with the tragic or weighty actions of the major plays. Henditis is often characterized by a kind of syntactical complexity that seems fathomable only by an intuitional understanding of the way words interweave their meanings. Wright is wonderful. We might also compare the verbal doubling of henditis with our binocular vision, 2 eyes, which allows us to see the three-dimensional world in greater depth. Likewise, henditis helps us penetrate beneath the surface of language and its meanings, while our conscious mind is mesmerized by the shimmering tensions between the paired words. Cognitive psychology has expanded our understanding of memory by distinguishing two major memory systems, implicit and explicit. These two memory systems are served by different neuroanatomical structures. At one level, language activates the explicit, more conscious memory system, but good creative writers use words to evoke our less conscious and less verbal feelings linked with our implicit memory. Oxford was a master of this use of complex language to appeal to both parts of our minds. Henditis assisted him in doing so. One of the several categories of henditis is the use of the second word to amplify the first. Amplificatio is a central rhetorical device enacted in miniature form in henditis. The Psalms characteristically use repetition for intensification. The Psalms profoundly influenced Oxford and probably contributed to his use of henditis for amplification and intensification. In addition, Wright discovers that Shakespeare sometimes uses the device for an interweaving, indeed something of a muddling of meanings, a deliberate violation of clear sense that is in perfect keeping with Shakespeare's exploration of things supernatural and causeless. So in conclusion, I have used converging lines of evidence to strengthen past attributions of the Golding translation of Oxford's Metamorphoses to the precocious, adolescent, literary genius Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. It coins more than 100 new words, including several still in common use. It uses 9 words with unusual double A spellings that appear nowhere else in early English books online. And this is consistent with the 5 double A words in de Vere's surviving letters that do not appear at all in Ebo. Its 14 coined words beginning UN are consistent with Shakespeare coining over 300 such words, and its 290 coined word pairs are consistent with Wright's estimate that Shakespeare coined more than 300 examples of henditis. As noted in the beginning, my thesis as the translator of this work enriches our knowledge of the early development of Shakespeare's literary powers.